Hello, everybody. My name is Ken Brown. I'm with NJIT and CCLR, the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar. As everybody knows, we're going to focus on the new grant announcement for multi-purpose grants, assessment grants, and cleanup grants from the EPA Brownfields program, and focus on what's new with the program and give folks some tips as you prepare your grant applications. Next slide, please. A couple of housekeeping items. So all of you attendees are on mute. If you have questions, please submit your questions in the questions box on the side of your screen, and we'll take as many questions as we can. We'll try and take some during the webinar and then leave some time at the end. A recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, and we will distribute a link to all of the participants, and we would very much appreciate your feedback on the webinar, so please respond to the survey that you get after the webinar is complete. Next slide. A couple of upcoming Brownfields events. For those of you who are interested around the country, there's a Tribal Response Program workshop on February 26th, 7th, and 8th in Omaha, Nebraska. And there's a Central Appalachian Regional Brownfield Summit in Kingsport, Tennessee on March 18th, 19th, and 20th. So please look for those events in your regions. Again, I'm Ken Brown. Our other presenters will include Rachel Lentz, who's the grants team leader and state and tribal lead for the EPA Office of Brownfields. Next slide, please. You'll also hear from Erica Rippey from the Center for Creative Land Recycling, Elizabeth Limbrick from New Jersey Institute of Technology, and next slide, Ignacio Dayreet, also for CCLR, the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and Maggie Egbarts from the Kansas State University TAB program. Next slide. A quick overview of today's webinar. We're going to start with a brief overview of the TAB program, the Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities program. You will then hear some tips if you're preparing assessment grants, some tips for preparing cleanup grants, some tips for preparing multi-purpose grants, then some general tips and tricks for developing effective applications. Maggie will talk a little bit about the TAB-EZ online grant writing tool, and then we will take as many questions as we have time for at the end as well. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Lentz from EPA, who's going to give you a little more background on the EPA TAB program. Rachel?
Yes, thank you, Ken. Hello, everyone. As Ken mentioned, my name is Rachel Lentz, and I work in the Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization and Headquarters. So what we call TAB is short for our Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities Program, and we have 3 technical assistance providers, all of whom have representatives today who are presenting at this webinar. And they provide support to communities across the country to provide technical assistance on a range of brownfields topics, anywhere from community involvement, health impacts, finance, liability, grant writing, redevelopment, helping to figure out, how to help secure or what to look for when hiring a contractor. And they have various tools and workshops and webinars, can provide some one-on-one assistance, do case studies, and have developed some web-based tools to help communities address, assess, clean up, and revitalize brownfields. And lastly, they're also doing some training and can be available to review some drafts of the EPA's multi-purpose assessment and cleanup grant proposals. So you can contact your TAB if you're interested in that. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are 3 technical assistance providers that provide assistance across the country. The first one is the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and they support communities mostly on the eastern seaboard. You can see they support communities in the red boxes, or the red areas highlighted in the map. And then we have Kansas State University, and they support many communities sort of in the middle of the country in purple. And lastly, third technical assistance provider is Center for Creative Land Recycling, and they support communities on the West Coast as well as New Jersey, New York, and our Caribbean territories. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, what is a brownfield? So a brownfield is any real property that is impacted by the potential of contamination or real contamination that impacts its expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of the property. And it could be contaminated by hazardous substances or petroleum or a combination of both. And there's an example of many different types of brownfields, anything from dry cleaners or gas stations or auto shops or buildings with asbestos or lead contamination in it that's impacting its ability to be reused. Next slide, please. And just really quickly, an overview of our FY19 competitive grants. We have assessment grants that provide funding to communities to inventory, assess, plan, and conduct community involvement around assessment activities at brownfield sites. And we typically give out about 114 grants per year, and last year we gave out 114 grants. And then we have our cleanup grants. And that grant is to provide grants to communities who have a site that needs to be cleaned up. And last year we awarded 40 cleanup grants at $11 million, and those are. And then lastly, we have our multi-purpose grants. This is a new grant program. Our legislation was recently enacted last March, and we have new authority for a multi-purpose grant. So for our first year, we, in FY19, will be having these multi-purpose grants, and so you can do a range of planning, assessment, and cleanup activities under these grants. And we are estimating that we'll award about 10 grants in FY19. And you'll be learning more about the specifics of these different grant programs as the different speakers talk about the tips for each of these grants. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Ken to talk about the benefits of a Brownfields grant.
So thanks, Rachel. Great job. I would like, for those of you who, particularly who are new to brownfields, I like to think of revitalizing brownfields, and particular brownfields grants are, one, they're an end in themselves in getting brownfields assessed, cleaned up, and revitalized, but they can also be a great tool. And one thing brownfields can serve as seed funding to both either launch a local brownfields program or to conduct initial site investigations at priority sites. I think it's important to know that assessment funding is very flexible. It can be used for multiple sites, so you can apply for a community-wide assessment grant in addition to site-specific. It can be used for reuse planning, for health assessments, brownfield staff, community involvement, and investigations. Brownfields funding can also be extremely effective in leveraging other resources from both federal, state, and local government, and also from the private sector. So those that are most effective at utilizing their brownfields funding will, for example, use an assessment grant to figure out the level of contamination, and with that, they might be able to get a cleanup grant either from EPA or a state cleanup grant. You might be able to leverage infrastructure dollars from your State Department of Transportation. You can use local community development block grant funds or other local sources of funding. So, but Brownfields funding, particularly early seed funding, can be used to leverage funding from multiple sources. And finally, I think it's useful to think about how Brownfields funding and Brownfields projects can help you achieve multiple community objectives, including everything from removing blight, environmental cleanup, transportation improvements, new affordable housing, waterfront revitalization, new parks and open space, and many other community revitalization needs. Next slide, please. A couple of big picture key changes to the FY 2019 guidelines, the current guidelines. One, as Rachel mentioned, we have a new grant program that was established through the BUILD Act called Multipurpose grants that you're going to hear more about. Secondly, in this particular round of competition for grants, there will be no revolving loan fund competition. There is a new shorter page limit. So when you're writing your assessment and cleanup grants, you no longer have, I believe it used to be 15 pages, you now only have 10 pages, so you have to be very efficient and succinct in writing your applications. I believe the page limit for the new multi-purpose grants is 12 pages. And for assessment and cleanup grants, you're no longer required to have letters of support to go with your applications. So with that, what we want to do is, here's an overview of the process. Obviously, the guidelines are out. The proposals are due on January 31st. That says 2017. That is not correct. It is actually January 31st, 2019. The EPA will announce the winners sometime in the spring, probably May or possibly June. Work plans will be negotiated between the winning applicants and EPA in the summertime, and then funding will be available sometime between July and October. With that, what we'd like to do is ask a couple of polling questions. So here's the first polling question, if you all would take a few minutes to respond. Whether you're from an urban community, rural, tribal, blended, or none of the above. All right. And now you can see the results. And we're going to do another polling question. Can you tell us which EPA region you're calling in from? As you can see, the regions are organized by the tab providers there. Very good. And I think we have one more polling question before we move on. The question is, have you applied for an EPA Brownfields grant in the past, or is this your first time? Looks like we have a bunch of experienced folks and a bunch of new people, which is great. Fantastic. Thanks everybody for participating in the polls. And let's move on to the next slide. Couple of basic tips to think about before you actually get going with writing your applications. First, it's very important to start working with your community early. Community involvement is very important. You need to demonstrate that in your application. So think about a process and procedures for engaging folks in your community. Number two, think about identifying and forming partnerships that are critical to the success of your program. That could be partnerships with other government entities in your region, with the state government, with private sector organizations, community organizations, and others who may be helpful in enabling you to achieve your brownfields revitalization goals. Think about internally within your local government, tribe, or nonprofit organization, which departments and which individuals are going to be key in helping you to administer your grant and do the work, implement your grant. So think about that in advance so that those folks are involved from the beginning. And then in addition, you want to think about identifying specific sites or areas of your community that are in need of revitalization, and that could be for site assessments, cleanup, or just overall brownfields revitalization. Next slide, please. And then we're going to talk a little bit later about the online tools, the Tab Easy online tools, and then also you should have the opportunity to participate in webinars and trainings offered by EPA or by the Tab programs. And then number 3 here is very important, which is particularly if you're new, you need to submit your proposal via grants.gov online. So it's very important to understand the tools and tips in advance. You need to have what's called a DUNS number. You need to be registered with the SAM system. And this 800 number here is a help desk for helping you work through all the grants.gov requirements. But sometimes it takes a while to get registered and work through these items. So you should get, if you're not registered with grants.gov and set up in that system, you should get started right away so that that doesn't become a barrier when you're ready to submit your application in January. Next slide, please. We are now going to go talk about the assessment grants. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Elizabeth, I believe. So Elizabeth Limbrick from NJIT, you are up.
All right, thank you very much, Ken. Yeah, I'm coming to you from Newark, New Jersey, so a warm welcome to everybody. I'm going to give you the deeper dive into the assessment grant program. As Ken mentioned, these are fantastic grants. They're very flexible. They can be used for a really wide range of activities. They get you from that earliest planning stages through your investigation all the way up to the cleanup plan. Now, they don't get you to the actual cleanup. That's what the cleanup grants are for that you're going to hear about later. But the performance period on these is 3 years, and EPA is expecting to award about 114 grants this particular cycle. So one of the first things I have up here is the brownfield inventories. And while they technically can be used to develop a brownfield inventory, one thing to keep in mind is that this grant program is very competitive. And in order to write a competitive proposal, you need to have some idea of what your brownfield sites are before you start putting your pen to the paper, as we mentioned a couple slides back. So while a brownfield inventory is an eligible expense, what might be a better use is to use that money to refine that list and maybe prioritize the sites that you do have. You can and probably should definitely be using the money to conduct phase 1 and phase 2 site assessments, site investigations, lots of planning activities. And while EPA in the past has always allowed some planning activities under the assessment grants, this year there is really a new focus on planning, and they have specifically said they will allow a market analysis and market evaluation. And I think that is absolutely huge. You can't find a lot of other grants out there that will fund those kinds of studies. So I think that's particularly exciting and wanted to highlight that. Now, of course, you can also use the funds for reuse assessments, again, for that cleanup and redevelopment planning activities, again, not for the actual cleanup, but for planning, for land use assessment, site designs, infrastructure evaluations, even for area-wide plans, the end use plans, even health assessments and a whole lot more. Even if you're using the money, though, to do these planning activities, keep in mind that you're still going to want to include some phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments in your program. And that is because if you read through the guidelines, EPA does say that they will review proposals that include at least 50% of the budget for phase 1 and phase 2s more favorably. Now, that said, they also say that proposals that include at least 30% of the budget for planning activities will be considered on what they call the other factors checklist. So just a couple things to keep in mind on that. You should also be conducting community engagement activities. I would definitely recommend putting a portion of your budget towards that. And you can also include travel and training, like attending the National Brownfields Conference. EPA always likes to see people attend that, and you can certainly use part of your budget for that. As far as eligibility and who can apply, essentially, think of it this way. It's basically all non-federal government, quasi-government, and tribal entities. I mean, you can go through and get the specifics if you have any questions about whether or not you fall into those categories. But the thing that's new this year that's really exciting is that they have expanded it to allow nonprofits to apply for assessment grants. So in the past, nonprofits have been able to apply for cleanup grants, but this is the first time they're going to be allowed to apply for assessment grants, and we're pretty excited about that. I do think that that's going to result in hopefully some more proposals coming into EPA. One final note on this slide is about existing grantees. So if you are an existing grantee, you have an open assessment grant with EPA right now, you need to have spent down 70% of your grant by New Year's Day in order to be eligible to apply for this cycle. Next slide. On this slide, I list out the different types of assessment grants that are available, and you can see the different amounts available for each type of assessment grant. So we have community-wide, site-specific, and coalition. I'm actually going to start in the center at the site-specific in the middle column. These are really appropriate when you have a specific site identified and you know that you want to spend the money on that site. You can only apply for one site-specific grant. However, you can also apply for one site-specific plus one community-wide at the same time. What you can't do is apply for either a community-wide or a site-specific plus a coalition. If you apply for a coalition, that's it. That's the only assessment grant you can apply for in that particular cycle. Now, I mentioned community-wide proposals. That's when you have several brownfield sites in your jurisdiction that you would like to use this money on. And then as far as coalition grants go, it's a higher limit. It's the $600,000, and with that, the lead coalition member submits the grant proposal. You have to work on at least 5 sites, and you have to have a group of at least 3 or more eligible entities that are going to submit this proposal under that one lead coalition partner. For the coalitions, I would say they're really generally a pretty good fit for things like, think like a small government or a rural area that just doesn't have the capacity to manage a grant on their own, but could get together with a couple of their neighbors and make it worthwhile. Now, with that said, of these 3 different types, if you're not sure which one you're going to go for, what I would tell you is oftentimes community-wide is a really good fit for a lot of people, and that is because the money is more flexible on that community-wide, more flexible than it is for a site-specific anyway. Again, on that site-specific, you have to know that you are going to spend this money on a specific site. You have to know that when that money becomes available a year from now, that site's still going to be available, that a developer has not swooped in and done all the work, and now what are you going to spend the money on because you can only spend it on that specific site. But if you know that, and maybe you need more than the $200,000 and you think you might be able to get that waiver, maybe then it makes sense to go for a site specific. But in most cases, probably going for a community wide is going to be your best bet. One thing I also wanted to mention is there is no cost share requirement for any of the assessment grants. So that's good news too. Next slide. This is a breakdown of the evaluation criteria for assessment grants. Also, what you're going to notice is that this year there are 4 major categories, and there used to be 5. So EPA really has made a lot of changes to the assessment grant guidelines and all the guidelines this year. Big changes, again, in 10 pages, you need to do everything listed here. So first section, they have reordered the sections as well. The first section is the project area description and your plan for revitalization. Now this is where you're going to tell EPA, this is my community, and this is the target area. These are the brownfield issues and their impacts on the community. This is how the grant is going to fit into the community revitalization plan. Now, a word of caution here. In the past, this is where I've seen a lot of applications fall short, is they don't do a good job of really tying in what this program is under this grant and how that ties into existing plans that the community already has. So make sure you do a good job there. You're also going to be telling EPA these are the anticipated outcomes and how my target area is going to benefit from redeveloping these brownfield sites. And this is our strategy to leverage those resources to redevelop the sites. All that is worth 30%. The next piece is the community need and community engagement. This is where you tell EPA why the target community is unable to fund the brownfield activities. So here you're also going to want to try to incorporate things like if it's an area of low income or a small size or an environmental justice community, you're going to want to tell EPA about that. You're going to want to tell EPA, if you give us this money, this is how we are going to fix all these problems in the community. This grant is going to help the populations in my target community that have a high incidence of health problems and that are disproportionately affected by environmental justice issues. This is how other community groups and partners are going to be involved, and this is how we're going to engage the community. The next section is the task description, cost estimates, and measuring success. And as you can see, this is a big section. This is 35% of your score. This is where you're going to tell EPA exactly what you are going to do with their money. You are going to be crystal clear to them. They want to know how you're going to spend the money. What tasks need to be accomplished, by whom, and by when. Give some detail in your budget. Discuss how you're going to track the project. How you're going to make sure you stay on your schedule, on your budget. I would recommend mentioning acres and any other software you might use to track your progress in this section. And then finally, the last section is programmatic capability and past performance. And this is now 15%. So in this section, this is where you kind of get to toot your own horn. This is where you tell EPA, we have the capacity, we're capable, and we are going to do a good job managing this grant. So altogether, your maximum number of points this year for an assessment grant is 100. Next slide. So just some general tips for assessment grants. Really, EPA is not interested in just funding a bunch of phase ones that go nowhere. They really want to see that there's a vision to get some kind of progression from an assessment, then to a cleanup or other grant programs, to a final revitalization. Now, they understand that's not all going to happen under this assessment grant, but you want to let them know that there's this vision and that you're capable of taking a project and getting it all the way through to that revitalization. So what I would tell you is the best assessment grant applications really involve projects where you already have identified a target area that's in need of assessment. You have a relationship with an existing community in your target area. You have access to some of those properties in the target area. So we're talking about in this one, a lot of times this happens, people apply for these funds and they think that they're going to be able to go on other properties that are owned by private property owners, and they think they have access to them, but when it all comes down to it and they've got the money and they're getting ready to go on the site to do a phase one or a phase two, all of a sudden the property owner gets cold feet. So to the extent that you can show EPA that that's not the case for you, that you've already gone through everything and you have access to those sites, I think that can really help bolster your proposal. And then lastly, again, I think sites that have some sort of significant either redevelopment or revitalization potential in that target area is really going to help you as well. It doesn't have to be an economic thing. It could be a park, but whatever it is, you need to, again, kind of have some significant potential to get the project done. Next slide. So just kind of to recap some of the changes and what's new for the assessment grants. Again, right off the bat, the big thing, and I think this is fantastic, is nonprofits can now apply for assessment grants. Next bullet point was, again, if you're an existing grantee, to make sure you have that 70% drawdown by New Year's Day. And EPA has some information in the guidelines specifically about what they are looking for there. And then finally, I think this is really fantastic as well, that assessment funds can be used for a wider array of planning activities, including those market analyses and market evaluations. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over, I think, to Ken.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was awesome. We have a couple of questions about assessment grants, which I'm going to take a couple of these for you. We'll start with you. First question is, can an assessment grant be used for a specific site that is part of a local revitalization plan but does not have a developer identified yet?
Yes, absolutely. Not all sites are going to have a developer identified, especially this early in the process. But definitely, yes, you can use the money on those sites. I mean, there's always some question. You have to go through site eligibility, make sure that the grantee isn't a responsible party for the contamination at the site. But yeah, it sounds like you should be able to do that.
And I would just add to that that you're going to have a more effective grant, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, if you have a revitalization plan for the area, or if part of your grant is to develop a revitalization plan for the area. Even if you don't have a developer, you either need to have a plan or use some of the funds here to develop your plan, be able to describe your area and why you want to revitalize it. Here's another one. If you have a 128A grant, can you apply for an assessment grant?
Yes, we've seen lots of people do that in the past. Basically, your state Department of Environmental Protection, a lot of them do have both programs. The only caveat here is if you're an existing assessment grantee, you need to have that drawdown done. But yeah, 128A and assessment grants, you can have both.
And then there were, let's see. What happens if a priority site ID identified in the grant application falls through and does not get assessed?
That's okay. EPA understands that there's a lot of moving parts with these grants, and especially with the timeline being what it is, which is basically, you apply now and you get your money October 1st, so it's almost a year. They understand that things change and that kind of stuff. So as long as it's a community-wide assessment grant or coalition grant, you're okay because you have a large area and you can pull from other sites. If you were talking about a site-specific assessment grant, then you're not going to be able to spend the money because, again, that money has to be spent on the specific site that was identified in the grant proposal.
Right. And the only thing I would add to that, again, is that you do need, if you do submit an application for site assessment, you do need to assess some sites. So it may not be the particular site that you identified in your application as one of your priorities, but it should be another site that has good potential for revitalization, should be assessed using the funding. So with that, let's move on to cleanup grants. Next slide, please.
Hi, everybody. This is Erica Rippey from the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Good afternoon from Oakland, California. And thanks, Elizabeth, for giving us the outline of the assessment grants. And I am going to be covering the cleanup grant program. And surprise, you can use these cleanup grant funds for cleanup activities at a single site or multiple sites in your target area. You can only submit one cleanup grant proposal this year, and if you do apply for cleanup, you cannot apply for a multi-purpose grant. Cleanup grant funds can also be used for program reporting, cleanup oversight, as well as environmental monitoring. And this year, there's also been a change that you can use a portion of your funding for buying environmental insurance. And we have the FAQs included on the downloadable handouts for this webinar, so feel free to download those, and if you have questions, you can reference that. No changes in eligibility for cleanup grants this year. And this year, you can only submit one cleanup grant proposal, but the amount has been raised to $500,000 from $200,000 per site. If you're working on multiple sites.
Hey, Eric, I was just going to say, I'm not seeing the slides flipping. I don't know if you're changing the slides.
No, I'm on the same slide. It's number 22 that's displaying.
I'm seeing the assessment grant changes slide. I'm not seeing any cleanup slides.
I can see it.
Yeah, Ken, it's displaying.
Okay.
Could someone from the audience please type in if you cannot see the cleanup grant slide? I don't want to overwhelm Ken with a bunch of questions, but okay, Ignacio can see them as well, Ken. So maybe
okay, all
try
good.
troubleshooting.
Yep, all good.
Okay,
Keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, cool. No worries. So yes, the amount has been raised per site to $500,000, as well as $500,000 per proposal for multi-site applications. Hang on. All right. And some of the application or some of the requirements for submitting the application include a copy of the community notification with a draft assessment of Brownfields cleanup alternatives, or ABCA. For multi-site proposals, your ABCA must be developed for each site, and you must also include a summary of comments received from the public, as well as public meeting documentation. And you have to have this community meeting by January 17th. A single community notification can be issued for a multi-site proposal as long as all sites are addressed and all communities are notified. You must prove that you are not the responsible party, and there is a 20% cost share requirement this year. I will go into that more in a future slide. And for multi-site proposals, the threshold and eligibility criteria, which is in Section 3B, must be met for each site. And the site has to never have received cleanup grant funds in the past. The cleanup rating breaks down the same way as the assessment grants, and Elizabeth gave a fantastic overview of that. And when you include your budget table, just some notes, separate out the cost for each site on a multi-site proposal, or include a separate table for each site. For the task descriptions, you can use the same language that's in the draft ABCA attachment, or attachments if you have multiple site proposals. So site eligibility determinations, new this year, which is listed in Section 7 of the BUILD Act. If you have acquired a property prior to January 11th, 2002, you are eligible for a Brownfields grant and can use the funds to address contamination on the property, even if you do not qualify as the bona fide prospective purchaser, provided that you are not the responsible party. Usually your eligibility, what we would recommend, your eligibility is determined by the state or the EPA if the state can't determine eligibility. So if you're at this point in your proposal or getting your partners and your application together, we recommend reaching out to your state DEQ or EPA project manager if you are at this point. You must be the sole owner of the site or all sites if you are applying for the multi-site grant by January 31st, 2018, and you have to maintain ownership throughout the grant period. So some tips for the cleanup grants. This is more general. And like Elizabeth mentioned, choose a site with a good story. It will help with your narrative. And when doing a cleanup grant, consider the components of the remedial action. So how this is going to impact the environment while you are doing remediation, as well as community and public health during your remediation plans. Alignment with regional revitalization plans is also important, and if you are able to prove significant revitalization potential, this is obviously very reflective of an impactful and important project that EPA should fund. Economic development benefits, if you have renewable energy components included in your project, specify that. If not, no worries. And last tip on this slide is be clear on your cost share requirement versus leveraging sources oversight. So do not cost share more than 20%. And if you are able to cost share more than 20%, use that additional funding in your strategy for leveraging resources section, or include a table with secured, pending, and potential funds. So do not include these funds, these leveraged funds, as your cost share. So put anything over 20% in your leveraged resources section. So the changes for the cleanup grants, sites must not have previously received cleanup grant funds. I just talked about the cost share requirement, and the site eligibility has changed a bit as well. So this year, explaining the threshold criteria is going to be very important. So I recommend getting in touch with your tab. We can help you, as well as your EPA grant or project officer and your state Brownfields office.
Great, thanks, Erica. I have a question on cleanup grants. If applying for a cleanup grant, how current does the phase 1 and/or 2 site assessments need to be?
Ignacio, I'm going to pass that to you.
Yes, good afternoon, folks. This is Ignacio David. I'm with CCLR also. At this point, you wouldn't have done an ABCA if you hadn't had a phase 2. And usually you would have done at least part of phase 1 to do the phase 2. Basically, since you already own the site and you're going to clean it up, you don't really need the AAI phase 1 at this point. But if you're going to sell it eventually after you clean it up, then you would want to be sure that the AAI phase 1 is updated prior to the sale of the property.
Great. And here's another question. Can you apply for both an assessment grant and a cleanup grant in the same cycle?
Yes.
What if a community does not have set revitalization plans in place?
That's possible. However, you probably will not be as competitive. EPA really does look, going back to the guidelines that both Erica and Elizabeth showed, having the roadmap, something that's imminent to redevelopment, is more competitive than those that are basically just being cleaned up.
Great. All right, let's, Ignacio, why don't you keep going and let's start on multi-purpose grants.
Yes, and again, good afternoon. And the most important thing that was not included in this slide is the multi-purpose grant is for $800,000. It is authorized for more. However, EPA wants to feel this grant out. Since it's a big chunk of money, they want to see how the response is and spread it around. So they will be awarding 10 grants for $8 million total for this grant round, and so that comes out to per one per region. So with $800,000, people can do a lot, and we expect it to be competitive. And basically, you can just replay what Elizabeth said and Erica said, because basically the multipurpose can do everything pretty much an assessment grant can. And by the way, you can do cleanup too. The difference is you have 2 extra pages to explain what you're going to do, and you have 5 years to do it instead of the 3 years under the assessment and cleanup grants. this is essentially a replacement for the area-wide planning grant. And looking at the history of area-wide planning grants, many of those grantees actually did, quote unquote, graduate to assessments and cleanups. So EPA saw the value of the collaboration and the research, the planning activities, and public participation and community building that came with area-wide planning grants. However, after getting an area-wide planning grant, you had to apply for an assessment, then a cleanup. And so rather than having really good grantees go through all of that, they put it all in a multi-purpose grant. You can only submit one multi-purpose grant per round, but you don't need coalition partners. I mean, you can essentially go it alone. And also, if you apply for a multi-purpose grant, you cannot apply for an assessment or a cleanup grant. Eligibility is the same. So next slide, please. Rating is also the same. So pretty much the same. What Elizabeth said is that you should have good area description and plan for revitalization. The difference would be here from what Elizabeth would have said is that EPA really, if you're looking at the area-wide planning approach, which this tends to be, it's not necessarily so, but I think that's where it came from, is that EPA really wants to focus on the planning and remedial activities, planning remedial on a particular site. So essentially, if you have an area that, like a corridor or a neighborhood that has one or a couple brownfields roadblocks, this is probably the grant for you, where you can plan, do community outreach, and within 3 years, possibly start cleanup planning. That's what they found in the area-wide planning grants. They graduated to other grants, and I think that is the objective of this grant. Also, next slide, please. So again, it's flexible, but it will be competitive because of the high dollar amount. If you are choosing between doing a assessment and a cleanup combined versus a multi-purpose, keep in mind, if your big brownfield, if your key brownfield site is in a neighborhood and could facilitate the redevelopment of other sites next to it, this is the grant for you. One thing to think about though, in cleanup grants, you can ask for a waiver if your community does not have financial capacity. You do not have that option with a multipurpose grant. You have to come up with $40,000. Multipurpose grants are designed for a bit more planning, though in the guidelines it does say that the EPA will give greater consideration to proposals that have 70% spend 70% on site-specific work, and that could include $200,000 for cleanup. So if you had $700,000, 70% on site-specific work, which includes $200,000 for cleanup, and do the rest for planning, outreach, and other programs, that's probably that's a sweet spot that EPA is looking for. Another thing about the multipurpose grant is you have to own a site that you might clean up, but it does not. You do not have to pass the eligibility test at the time of the application. If later on you find that the site that you own is not eligible for one reason, you can find another site to fill its spot to meet. For the cleanup. Next slide. So that's really it for multipurpose. I will pause for any questions before I go to the general tips. So Ken, any questions for a multipurpose grant?
I'm looking for a multipurpose grant. Hang on. Here's an assessment question that you could knock off real quick, Ignacio. Can we buy environmental insurance with assessment grant funding?
I do not think so.
Only with cleanup grant funding?
Only with cleanup, and I would assume you can do that with the multipurpose grant too. I will check the guidelines.
Yeah, I believe. Yes, I think you can with a multipurpose grant as well.
Yes, you may. Yes, that's true.
Let's see. Why don't you keep going with general tips while I look for more questions?
Yes, so I'll just go over a few tips and then hand it over to Maggie at Kansas State University. And these tips, again, are general to all the grants. Again, we cannot stress that you read the guidelines. Don't count on your tab provider or even a consultant, if you have one, to tell you what the guidelines say or don't say. Read them yourselves. And particularly format requirements, the margins, page numbers are good for your reviewers. Get to your DUNS and SAM very early. And we haven't mentioned Workspace yet, but Workspace is an application within grants.gov that you use to compile your grant information. So there are YouTube webinars on Workspace, so do that all now because you don't want to do this in the last week. Our suggestion is be ready to submit, or at least stage everything a week before so that you're not fumbling on the last day before you're submitting. Do not assume the reviewer understands your region. Sometimes even your TABR, your K-State or NJIT might know too much about you that they take for granted that that the reviewer might understand it. Do not do that. Have someone who is not affiliated to review your grant. An outside editor helps. Next slide. It's always, this is all about projects and programs, not about the grant. So people like to see the money, but in essence, if you don't have a great project, you're not going to get the money. Target areas, sites that are to be redeveloped, revitalization goals that are in line, projects that are in line with revitalization goals that address your challenges. And community engagement, getting everyone on the same page. Next slide, please. Financial need. That's changed a bit, but in essence, this EPA does want to see both how, why your community can't raise the money and why your local government or the nonprofit doesn't have the funds to carry out the program. And that's where leveraging comes in. I think this year, particularly for cleanup and multipurpose, if you don't think about leveraging at the outset, you're kind of dead in the water. You have to think forward beyond the grant to see what other funds you will need to finish out an assessment and or a cleanup or any planning, all the way to redevelopment, because that makes you think about your partnerships, that makes you think about next steps, that makes you reach out to other potential partners, and essentially helps you through this whole grant process in the first place. So think leveraging, think partners, think next steps. If you're just thinking about the money, you're not going to go very far. And back to basics, make sure your numbers add up. We always see a lot of grant applications where the numbers are inconsistent across the text and the tables, and the calculations. When you're explaining your costs, make sure you do the calculations to show EPA how you came up with numbers, that they're not out of a hat, some random numbers. Those never work. And back to numbers, you have to quantify your indicators if you can, your outcomes and your outputs, because that's what EPA relies on to keep this grant program going, which is why they want you to fill out your acres. If you're an existing grantee and your acres is not up to date, you're going to be sunk the moment you go to programmatic capability. You can't talk your way out of that. Your acres has to be up to date. One way of doing that is also, know what's a Tab Easy, because Tab Easy does have a tool. They have an inventory tool as well as the grant application guide that they have, which Maggie will talk about right now. So Maggie, are you there? Go ahead.
I have a couple questions for you, Ignacio. One is, the question is, how does a serious developer participate in a multi-purpose grant if they enter partway through the 5-year grant period, and especially if they're kind of in the middle of any planning?
Did you say how does an interested developer?
How does a serious developer participate in a multi-purpose grant if they enter the scene kind of partway through the 5-year grant period?
Okay. Well, yeah, we must note that private entities are not eligible to receive any kind of federal grants. Now, if they're a nonprofit developer, that's different. But a for-profit developer coming in, EPA likes to see all kinds of developers coming into the process. And a developer coming in midway, perhaps, if they are interested in one of the sites that the city or the grantee is looking at to assess and redevelop, they can make it known, and it's not going to help bring more EPA money in, but that's a leveraging that EPA is talking about, because the developer brings outside resources that can be leveraged. It helps both. It really does help in any kind of future grants the city might apply for. For instance, if the city decides to get an RLF or helps the city, the developer, work with the developer to get a loan or a sub-grant for a site, then that's how they can participate. Again, it won't go to their pocket, but it would help the project they're working on. So any money, government money that goes to an eligible entity for assessment or cleanup that helps the bottom line will help the developer eventually.
And the only thing I would add to that is that the actual objective of the multi-purpose grants was to provide some dollars for experienced communities that to give them more flexible dollars that would be used to effectively partner with developers. So the idea is, if there's a developer that emerges and there's a good site and there's a good project, that you would have, let's say, $200,000 or $300,000 of cleanup dollars would help you get a site ready and then flip it to a developer. If that happens midway during the grant process, that's great. The goal is to have more flexible dollars that can be used to actually make projects happen, to bring projects to fruition. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Maggie to continue on with our overall tips.
Hi, thanks, Ken. I'm going to go over just real briefly what Tab Easy is and some of the benefits to using TabEZ to help write your grant proposal. Again, this is Maggie with Kansas State Tab. So TabEZ is our online grant writing tool that is free to use for anybody. It's available on our website by visiting www.ksutab.org. Next slide. Again, it's free to use. You do need to sign up for a user account, but it can be accessed anywhere, anytime. It's helpful when you're drafting your narrative. You can kind of go at your own pace. It's password protected, so it is a secure platform for you to use. It also allows you to collaborate. If you have multiple people that are drafting the proposal, TabEZ provides a single platform where multiple people can write in the proposal, and it just helps you keep track of everything, as you'll see kind of on the next slide. So TabEZ provides a template for assessment and cleanup grants only. It currently is not set up for the multi-purpose grants. However, throughout TabEZ, there are several helpful hints or additional resources that are shown highlighted in red text. So even if you're applying for a multi-purpose grant, you might want to look at TabEZ just because some of the information provided is going to be applicable to a multi-purpose grant. Once you set up your account and you configure your grant application, you'll see on this slide, it provides an outline. And if you are going to have multiple people contributing to the narrative, there'll be a column that shows who updated it, the date that they updated it, and whether or not that section is complete. A few key things to note when you're working with TabEZ, on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's either a view button or an edit button. If it just says view, you can just click on that and it provides some useful information taken from the grant guidelines or maybe a helpful hint. If there is an edit button, that indicates that you need to complete that section for that particular grant that you're drafting on. Next slide. So once you click edit, you will be directed to a specific page for that particular section. This slide kind of shows an example for the section of an assessment grant 1AI, where you would talk about the background and description of your target area. What TabEZ does is it compiles all of the grant criteria into one particular area. So what we've done is we've pulled the criteria from Section 4 of the guidelines, and we have also incorporated the evaluation criteria, and we put it all in one spot so you can see and make sure that you are addressing not only the guideline criteria, but the evaluation criteria. You'll notice here a helpful hint that's in red text. If you click on that, that provides just some additional information for you to help do your narrative for this section. Each little tab here has its own text box that you actually write the narrative in. If you've already started working on your proposal, there's a nifty paste from Word button feature that you can use. And there's also a character count for each section that helps you kind of keep track of where you're at. We typically say when you're using TabEZ, there's about 3,300 to 3,900 characters per page. And so that kind of helps you keep track of where you're at. Next slide. If you are collaborating with multiple writers, you can use the add comments feature within TabEZ, and it just allows you to kind of make notes either to yourself or to other people that may be helping you draft your proposal. You can also, at the bottom of each section, there's a view revisions tab that you can click, and you can see who made what revisions on what day. When there is you'll see here for this particular section, we actually, Tabby Z included the budget table that is presented in the guidelines. For the community involvement section, I don't have a slide for that, but the guidelines do reference a suggested table format for indicating your community partners. That is already incorporated into Tabby Z. So you simply just click in the budget table and put in your specific information, but it's already there. The columns are auto-populated to add automatically when you input your data. So that in of itself can sometimes be useful. Next slide. And there's one specific to the cleanup grant proposal also, and you will see that this particular budget table for a cleanup grant includes a line item for the 20% cost share. Next slide. Tabby Z is an assistance tool, so it doesn't really write the grant for you or compile it. So after you have completed each section within Tabby Z, that gets notified by those green dots that you see there on the screen. You then need to export your narrative to Word to finalize any editing and formatting, you know, making sure that you're meeting those text requirements that was mentioned earlier today, and that it looks good, and it's ready to go for submittal. And you'll see down here at the bottom, this is the main outline template home screen. It'll show you your character count for each of the sections of your entire application. I would say for the 10-page limit, you're looking at anywhere from 35,000 to about 40,000 for total characters. Next slide. Some additional resources that are available through the ksutab.org webpage. If you click on the resources tab heading at the top, some of the information that is provided on the webinar for you to download is also available here. All the guidelines, FAQs, some examples of past grant proposals, and just a whole slew of information is available on the website. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ken.
Great, thanks, Maggie. We have a bunch more questions, and we still have a lot of people on the line. So if the panelists are prepared to stick around for a little longer, I think we should at least do a handful more questions.
Sure.
Everybody up for that?
Sure. Yeah.
So here's one for Ignacio on multi-purpose grants. Do you need to own the site or a site before applying for a multi-purpose grant?
Yes.
So you don't need to own, but to clarify, you don't need to own every site in your target area. You need to own at least one site in your target area, correct?
Yes. Yes, one site, but you do not need to go through all the eligibility that you have to go through under a cleanup grant. Another question, if planning is complete and the intended site reuse is part of the revitalization plan, can multi-purpose grant be used for redevelopment activities, such as installing infrastructure as part of the environmental covenants placed on the site? That's a pretty technical question there, Ignacio. Well, I guess it's the infrastructure, quote unquote, is a cap that serves as a, you know, institutional control, then you could justify that. But if it's or if it's a road that covers contamination that's underground, you know, which the regulatory agency allows you to do, then fine, you can do that. But you can't do it for something unrelated to the cleanup activity. So it's got to be part of the cleanup plan.
Right, it's got to be integral to the, you know, a significant component of the cleanup grant, cleanup plan.
Cleanup plan.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. Here's a question. Can somebody address the issue of owning a site before 2002? Could somebody clarify that? Elizabeth, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So if you acquired a site prior to 2002, EPA has clarified some liability issues on that. So in the past, they said you had to have done your phase one all appropriate inquiry, even though the law didn't come into effect until I think it was 2001 or 2002. So now they're saying, we recognize that that's kind of hard for people to prove that they did all appropriate inquiry when the law wasn't even in effect yet. So they've gotten rid of that piece of it, saying that you had to do your all appropriate inquiry. That said, if you were the responsible party who contaminated the site, that's a different story. You're still not eligible. But if you just failed to do your due diligence in a phase one, you could now be eligible. And does anybody else have any additional comments on that?
I think you got it. I think a lot of communities basically were holding the bag in 2002 with no records. So it just covers those circumstances.
Here's another question. Can a former landfill be considered a brownfield and eligible for site assessment or cleanup dollars?
I can try and answer that. So the answer on the face of it is yes. However, again, it goes back to whether or not you are a responsible party. So, for instance, if it's a municipal landfill and it's the municipality applying, that municipality would be a responsible party and would not be eligible.
Right. So a scenario where it might work is if it were a privately owned landfill and you wanted to do an assessment on that landfill, and that the landfill owner was willing to give you access to do the assessment on the site, that would be eligible, right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, and it could even be like, as long as they're two distinct branches of government that are not intertwined in any way. So say maybe something like a county government versus a municipality, a county government might be able to go after the grant, that kind of thing, even if it's a municipal landfill.
And then again, it would not have to be a RCRA site or a Superfund site or under any kind of an enforcement order. So that those issues would come into play as well. So basically, if you have a landfill that you're, or a significant site like that, you should talk to your EPA region or your local tab provider to have discussion about the eligibility of those sites.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ken. I think people should be doing that now. If you have any question at all about site eligibility, EPA is available to talk to you about that, and you should be talking to them right now before you, spend a lot of effort working on a proposal for a site that, wouldn't be eligible.
Yeah, and especially for landfills, because many states have different oversight agencies for landfills, and sometimes they're overlapping. So getting that cleared out takes a lot of time.
All right. For clarity, the planning can be, this would be an assessment grant, or I guess potentially let's just say an assessment grant. The planning can be used for community-wide planning, correct? So it does not have to be used for only planning the brownfields site they are targeting, correct? And that could be multi-purpose or assessment. Somebody want to take that? Elizabeth, you want to take that?
So yes, you can use it for area-wide planning. I'd always try to tie in, the brownfield back to it personally. But yes, it's a much wider range now of what you can use the money for. But also keep in mind that, again, you need to be doing phase 1s and phase 2s with this money as well.
Right. I think that's really important. So it can't just be general community-wide planning. It needs to be community-wide planning in a brownfield context. So it needs to be brownfields revitalization community-wide planning, number one. And number two, you can't spend the full grant on planning. You can spend part of it on planning, but you need to spend dollars on site investigation as well. And that would be the same with the multi-purpose grant.
Yeah, there were percentages that Elizabeth and I both mentioned. So the planning, they don't want you to use all the money on planning. For multipurpose, they wanted 70% on site-specific related work. And I think it's similar for assessment.
Okay, we are a nonprofit organization analyzing a site to purchase. Can we apply for the assessment grant even though we don't yet own the building? We would work with the current owner to gain access.
So if they're applying for an assessment grant, yes, you do not need to own the property to apply for an assessment grant. But you would want to prove to EPA that the property owner would give you access. That would certainly help bolster your application. If you were applying for a cleanup grant, then the answer is you must own it by the date that the grants are due, which this year is January 31st.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. If you're applying for a site-specific assessment for one particular site, do you have to own the site, Elizabeth, correct? For a site-specific? I haven't looked at that yet.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No, I think any assessment grant, it can be privately owned. You just need to be able to demonstrate that you can get access to the site. And then also you want, if you're doing a site-specific assessment grant, you need to, make a stronger case about, what the revitalization plan is going to be for that site too.
But I think, a word of caution, if you don't have site control, even though if you have access, I think EPA will look more favorably on a site where the nonprofit already owns it, or if it's part of an area-wide. So, a community-wide assessment.
I think that's right. Can the funds be used, not clear exactly which funds, be used on a property that was given to the city, but the city has not accepted the property yet? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Go ahead, Ignacio.
Oh, so go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was just going to say, if it's an assessment, it goes back to what we just said before, which is you do not need to own the property. If it's a cleanup grant, the answer is the person needs to own it. Fee, simple, title. You must have that awesome document in your hand on the date that you apply for this, January 31st, for cleanup grant.
Here's a good question. Can an assessment grant be used to pay for engineering and legal fees to secure access into a site?
I think so.
I don't think so, but what do you think, Ignacio?
Well, if you're going to say in your grant application that you're going to sue a property owner to get access, you're not going to be as competitive whether you use the money or not. This is all about cooperative grants. That's why you have partnerships. But I understand many communities do not have that option all the time when you have recalcitrant property owners. I have to look at that. I mean, I've never seen it I don't see it happen very often where you have unresponsive property owners.
Okay, here's another question. Is there a threshold for population size of an eligible entity for evaluating limited capacity to manage their own EPA cooperative agreement? And and just maybe you could discuss that more generally, how you would assess limited capacity to manage for an entity's ability to manage its own cooperative agreement. Elizabeth, you want to take that?
Sure.
Since you've been doing some thinking about that.
The quick answer is no, there is no magic number that is the limited capacity number. But typically, I think what EPA is really trying to hone in on here is, things like, think about like a rural area that has like a really small population and a really small government staff. Maybe all they have is like a part-time mayor who also serves as like chief cook and bottle washer. That is limited capacity, and that's the kind of thing that EPA is looking for.
So that's ranking. So you just have to explain in the ranking criteria how you would. That would be the third option. If they've never had a grant, they have to show that they'd be capable. Or if they've had a grant in the past, how they did it and what their outcomes and outputs were. Maggie had a question she typed in. Did you see that?
I did not, but Maggie, why don't you ask it? Since I got a million questions I'm looking at.
Okay,
Go for it,
yeah,
Maggie.
I had this one come through email. So if the state environmental agency is the lead coalition member for a coalition assessment grant, and the other two coalition members are regional planning bodies, does the geographic area described in the proposal need to be the entire state?
It does not need to be the entire state. They can, pick a subset of, their larger jurisdiction and use that for a target area if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Absolutely.
And
the purpose of a coalition is to focus on the areas with where the strengths of the coalition members are, and to support those members. So even if the state is a lead, if you have two regional entities, you don't have to focus on the entire state.
And that happens all the time.
Some questions on letters of support. One is, we've stated that letters of support are not required for assessment and cleanup grants. What about multi-purpose grants, Ignacio?
No, there are no requirements. You're going to have a table of contacts and their role, and that's where you should put as many people or groups that are participating with their contact information, because EPA will call them up. And the follow-up question is, even though letters of support are not required, are they still encouraged, or do the grant reviewers not want to see them at all?
Don't submit them. Don't submit anything extraneous that EPA is not asking for.
Yeah, there's one thing that I came in a question outside this forum regarding programmatic capacity, particularly for grantees that only have one grant and may have received other grants. I was going to mention this, but if you're a EPA grant, previous EPA grantee, be sure to answer that. You can add other grants you've received, but make sure you respond to everything that the EPA asks you regarding your Brownfields grant. You'll be space limited, so you might not get to the other grants that you may have success on.
And Ignacio, actually, I had a similar question come to me via email, and it was about folks who haven't had a grant in a long time, and how do they talk about whether or not they have experience with acres if basically they don't have experience with acres because it's been so long since they had a grant. And the answer is basically that EPA is splitting the proposals into basically two pools. There's one that's considered like the new grantees who don't have a current EPA grant and haven't had one since 2011. And then they have another pool where they're looking at folks who've had a grant that closed in either 2011 or later. And so anyone who is in that new grantee pool is likely to maybe have the same issues with acres, that they aren't as familiar with it, although I guess that's not completely true since acres has been around since maybe the mid-2000s. But certainly one of the things that somebody could do in that situation is talk about how they're going to work with a contractor who does have experience with acres.
Right, and if you're in the former where you haven't had a grant for a while, be sure you say property profile form, because that's the magic word there. That's what you had to submit your reports on.
Can anybody say anything about the cost share waiver?
That's for cleanup.
How does
grants?
What's for cleanup grants, and what do you have to do to justify it? Basically, I think is the question.
Well, one thing is this year they're only looking at communities, smaller communities. I think it's communities of 50,000 or less that would even be eligible to be considered for a cost share waiver.
So basically you need to demonstrate that both you're below the threshold size, number one, and number two, that you can't afford to cover the cost share, and you need to demonstrate that via local demographics. Okay. Let's see. Let's take one more if I can find one more good one.
And for all those people hanging on, please respond to the survey that you'll get as soon as we finish up.
Can cleanup grants be used to pay state-specific programmatic fees related to cleanup?
Oversight fees? Sure.
Yes. I did not know that. Thank you. And here's just to clarify, we answered this question. If you're going to assess and clean up multiple sites under the multi-purpose grant, do you have to own all of the sites in your target area or just one? To reiterate, you only need to own one site.
Well, you would have
at the time of
at
the type of your grant application.
Yeah.
You need to own the site in order to spend cleanup money on them. But at the time of your application, you need to demonstrate that you own at least one site in the target area.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, we got. Okay, we're.
So with that.
Here, so.
Yep, I think we should wrap it up. There are clearly a lot of questions. I'd like to thank the audience. I want to emphasize that there is free technical assistance out there through the TAB program. You heard about TAB EZ. The TAB programs will do proposal reviews. So I don't know if you want to quickly show the other polling questions, Erica, but you need to give the tabs at least one or 2 weeks advance notice to get a proposal review. So reach out to your tabs early if you'd like them, and it's invaluable to have an outside expert like Ignacio or Elizabeth or Erica or Maggie or the many other consultants who are available to help review grant applications. So I strongly recommend that you reach out to them if you'd like them to take a look at your proposals. Wow, a lot of people look like they want to apply. That's awesome. Next question. We have another polling question. If answered yes, do you know what kind of grant you're going to apply for? You only have to select one, even though you can do both assessment and cleanup.
All right.
Looks like a lot of assessment grants. Still big demand for assessment grants. Great. And do you have one more, Erica? Sorry, Erica.
Yeah, can we do?
Will you send your draft application to your tab? Again, strongly recommend that you do that and get them in early, because if there are a lot of you getting your applications reviewed, be sure you get them in early. I want to mention, these aren't my slides, but I'll just go ahead since we're about wrapping up. The state Brownfields programs, remember you need to get letters of acknowledgement, site-specific eligibility determinations, and other technical assistance. Your states can provide great assistance, and the EPA regional offices can help you, as we talked about earlier. Next slide. Again, here's the timeline. Deadline, January 31st. Winners announced in the spring, work plans in the summer, grants awarded between July and October. And I think that's it, right? Great. And here's our contact information. We'll leave this up here for a few minutes if you want to jot that down. And again, we will send you a link to the webinar recording and slides to everybody who participated today, so you'll have this information, and feel free to contact any of us with questions or if you want additional information. And with that, I'd like to thank the audience, and then I also want to thank all of our presenters, Elizabeth from NJIT, Ignacio and Erica from CCLR, Maggie from Kansas State University, and Rachel from EPA. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ken.
And good luck. Good luck with your grants, your grant applications.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Good luck.